One of the more complex national security threats facing the United States today centers on the prevalence of disinformation on social media and the use of social media platforms by adversarial powers to soak up sensitive information about Americans. At the center of this issue is the Chinese-owned platform TikTok, and debate over the depth of the threat posed by TikTok is serious. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at The Washington Times, and this is the special Washington Times Threat Status video series with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a research institute focused on identifying, analyzing, and eliminating U.S. national security threats on the global stage. For this edition, we're lucky to be joined by Craig Singleton, the director of FDD's China program and a senior researcher here with insight on cyber disinformation and malign influence operations run by China's intelligence agencies. Craig, you previously spent more than a decade in sensitive national security roles within the U.S. government. Let's jump into this. The TikTok issue is heated in Washington. There are several lawmakers that want TikTok banned from the U.S. social media space. Others want to force a sale of it to U.S. companies. Others say the sort of free market media space just shouldn't be tampered with. What do users or parents of users, there are some 150 million, mostly young people on TikTok right now in the U.S. What is the threat? What do they need to know about TikTok that's different from, say, Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or Instagram?
Yeah, no, thanks, Guy. I think parents, and as a parent myself, have a lot of good reason to be concerned about TikTok. One of the key differences about TikTok and what makes it so unique is that the Chinese are not simply trying to impact what our kids are seeing. They're trying to impact how they think, how they see the world. Throughout TikTok and its parent company ByteDance, the Chinese Communist Party has ideological cells installed at every single level of the company, from the C-suite on down to the basic engineer. And the reason is that they can control the algorithm and the platform itself. So they can choose to amplify certain content and suppress other content. So they can amplify, for example, content that portrays the United States as chaotic and dysfunctional, that makes Chinese governance and Chinese autocracy appear like a more sensible form of governance. It's Marxist-Leninism beats capitalism. It's more just, it's more fair.
But let's look at it, this ByteDance issue, right? So ByteDance is like a pseudo-private company in China, right?
There's no such thing as a private company in China anymore.
Okay, so
this is a big myth.
The concern is that from a national security standpoint, the concern is that ByteDance is somehow in collusion with Chinese state security or the Chinese Communist Party, or that ByteDance is potentially sharing sensitive user information, things like geographic positioning, keystroke, biographical information, facial expression information from the cameras on phones, and it's sharing it back with some massive Chinese intelligence database that could be used for adversarial purposes in the future, or is it more about disinformation, which is kind of what you're getting at, about using this platform to sow discord and to sow anti-American sentiment among young people who are using it? Which is it really from the national security perspective?
It's all the above. There's no one size fits all here. This is an everything platform to them. The Chinese structure doesn't enable anymore this idea of a private company. A private company that can determine and do whatever it wants to do in China. All Chinese companies, by Chinese law and Chinese regulations, are required to work in service of China's party state. They are required to provide information, every and all information that they have at their disposal, to the Chinese government for purposes that they may not fully understand, and in ways that we may not fully understand today.
Okay, so if we're looking at the disinformation angle, we're in an election year here.
Absolutely.
And how concerned are you about this idea that somehow TikTok is a vessel through which Chinese intelligence will try and disrupt or sow discord around the coming presidential election in the United States?
So
Is that already happening?
Sure. Quietly in December, the Biden administration released a declassified intelligence assessment that said just that about the 2022 midterms, that the Chinese were actively manipulating and interfering in our electoral process. And one of the key facets of that report was this idea of sowing disinformation and undermining trust in democracy. That is a key facet to what they're doing.
How prevalently was TikTok referenced in this declassified report?
It's there, but they're not just relying on TikTok. They're thinking about Meta's platforms, Twitter. It's across platforms, cross-platform operations.
But China doesn't own Meta and Facebook and Instagram and all these things. It owns TikTok, which rivals their popularity among young American users. I want to ask you about the debate in Washington, because there are a couple of lawmakers, particularly on the Democratic side, who are pushed for, Mark Warner, Virginia Democrat, he was pushing legislation to try and expand the U.S. government's power to control TikTok or potentially ban it. That legislation didn't really go anywhere. Now there's legislation from, I think it's Maria Cantwell, another Democrat, Washington. I think it's called the GUARD Act. I don't know that that's published yet, or it's a version of it circulating, that would potentially expand government power as well. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, is probably the most famous and loved among Republicans in this Biden administration, but she's kind of come out and said, I would support that. Tell me a little bit about this. Why is it so hard to pass this legislation? What are the implications of this?
There have been a lot of false starts. ByteDance has the best lobbying sort of structure that money can buy here in the United States. Today, they employ some of the most powerful K Street firms to advance their interests, whether it's Crossroads Strategies and Melman and Denton's. They are putting their money where their mouth is. And their goal is to influence and gum up the process. The best way to think about it is, in today's modern age, information is a currency, and autocrats are keen to use it to buy leverage. And so what they're going to do through these false starts is come up with a million reasons why we couldn't possibly ban TikTok, a million reasons why we can't force divestiture of TikTok, all by weaponizing our legal structure to achieve their objective. And so what they're seeking to do, as they've done in other industries, right, is to buy time for TikTok to become even bigger and more popular, just like they did in the drone space with DJI, just like they've done in the biotech space with BGI, so that they get too big to sanction, too big to fail, too embedded in our society. And that is all achieved through lobbying and communication strategies here in DC.
Aren't there also ideological implications? Because we're talking a little bit about free speech here, right?
Absolutely.
And U.S. government laws to shut down a global tech company, what does that mean for Facebook, a global Meta, a global tech, Instagram? These are global tech companies. Is that drawing pushback as well? And
Absolutely. I mean, and the companies like ByteDance and others are keen to weaponize that.
Interesting.
Right. What's our greatest strengths are also sometimes our greatest weaknesses. And our pluralism and our constitution and our devotion towards liberty and rights create protections. And so the Chinese are very keen to come up with lots of reasons why we can't do things by going back to our founding documents and sort of basic tenets of our way of life.
Let's jump with that and try and shift a little bit here to the broader picture, right? Because what I think we're discussing is kind of this disinformation and almost intelligence war that's going on between the United States and China increasingly. And I think it fits within this wider narrative about an evolving U.S.-China Cold War. Do you agree with that? Is that how you would frame it?
I think it's an all of society challenge. I think for too long, the confrontation between the United States and China, whether it's in the intelligence space or otherwise, was occurring in the shadows. The average American wasn't fully aware of what was going on. The last year has, I think, changed the average American's view. It started with the spy balloon. It was something that was visceral to most Americans. You could see it crossing your state, your town. And it was their first sort of interaction with great power competition on a visceral level, very much in the way that Sputnik was during the Cold War. You could see the blinking light in the sky and know that they beat us there, right? And that was a key driving factor in our society to say, what is the Soviet Union seeking and striving to achieve? And I think that today we sometimes forget that the Chinese have had an adversarial perspective on the United States for decades. We're only just starting to wake up to it on an everyday personal level.
But what I think we're talking about also is like this idea that the Chinese Ministry of State Security, that's really the biggest intelligence agency in Beijing,
For now.
is also expanding. There are
Sure.
some here in the U.S. national security community who worry that it's actually accelerating in its sophistication at a faster rate than
Sure.
the U.S. intelligence community globally. And what do you think of that? Is that an accurate portrayal? I mean, Chinese intelligence, U.S. intelligence, are they rivals in terms of capability at this point?
The Chinese certainly seem to be putting greater investment in the MSS. And the MSS is playing a far more public role in China in terms of leading campaigns of fear and intimidation as part of this anti-corruption purge, in a way that the MSS was an organization that was not discussed in China publicly at all until rather recently. Very different than here in the United States, where we talk about the FBI or the US intelligence community overtly, and there is a little bit of transparency into what they do.
Or oversight.
Oversight,
by Congress.
exactly. Something
degree.
exists, some check, some balance. That doesn't exist in China.
Much more immense secrecy.
Absolutely, and they relish that secrecy. It's in some ways akin to sort of the Soviet Union, where Soviet leaders played favorites within the Soviet intelligence apparatus at times, where there were favorites. One day you were up and one day you were down, and you were one sort of corruption scandal away from a big purge. And so today the MSS does enjoy seemingly the ear of Xi Jinping. That could change tomorrow, and they shift resources to the MPS, the Ministry of Public Security, or they shift resources back towards the People's Liberation Army intelligence apparatus. There's going to be a constant shell game in that space, but we do have to recognize in the aggregate that the Chinese are investing heavily in those organizations, and they operate differently than we do. They aren't just trying to steal secrets and inform Chinese policymakers about our plans and intentions. They're actively seeking to subvert our way of life. They're actively working to steal our intellectual property, and they're actively working to undermine US legitimacy around the world. That's very different from the way that the US government tends to operate in the intelligence space.
And within that, is there concern about artificial intelligence? That the MSS is perhaps a little bit more advanced or challenging us when it comes to capability with deploying artificial intelligence going forward?
I think the Chinese have invested so heavily in artificial intelligence domestically through companies like ByteDance, that there is no line, there is no wall between the Chinese state and these Chinese companies. So the Chinese intelligence apparatus can very easily tap into not just the data, but the AI tools that these companies are using and then repurpose them for intelligence purposes.
And is the United States doing the same thing to a certain degree? Is the U.S. intelligence community making moves to compete with this? Ultimately, I want to end with who's winning.
Who's winning? I think they're sort of fighting two different wars, right? Because they're structured differently and their missions are different. There's no doubt that in the prior Trump administration and the current Biden administration, we're making big investments in tech in the defense space and the intelligence space. People recognize the value of big data, making sense of it, making it actionable, and sharing information as broadly as possible so that we don't operate in silos. But the Chinese are thinking more about weaponizing that information for nefarious purposes. And that is a key distinction between the two.
And are U.S. diplomats and U.S. intelligence officials able to make that point to the Chinese government, that there's concern about that here in the national security community? Do we need to have more diplomacy on that, or what?
We just haven't seen a real desire to confront the Chinese about their malign behavior on any level, but particularly in the tech space. You know, we've talked about developing here, right, a small garden with a high fence. This idea that we're going to protect a small, limited number of critical technologies and prevent the Chinese from getting ahead in those areas. It's been hit or miss as a process just to establish those sorts of guardrails. No guardrails exist on the Chinese side, right? So we find ourselves at this critical moment where we say the future of the 21st century will be decided based on who understands and holds the power in these key critical technologies, AI and quantum and hypersonics and biotechnology and semiconductors. And the Chinese have made it very clear that they are pursuing an all-out approach on all 5 issue areas. Whereas we are at a point where we're even sort of timid in describing and articulating the 5, let alone employing existing tools to start to cut off technology flows and capital flows in a way that keeps us in the lead. We feel very much 5 years behind where I think the Chinese are. But the key is whether Washington's going to wake up.
Craig Singleton, totally interesting, very informative. Thank you so much for joining me for this part of the special Washington Times Threat Status video series. We appreciate your insights a lot. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.